In this video, you'll learn about a very important theory of learning called operant conditioning. You'll learn about specific concepts, including the different types of reinforcement and punishment. You'll learn about primary and secondary reinforcers, schedules of reinforcement and shaping, as well as behavior modification. So classical conditioning falls underneath an approach of learning that we call behaviorism, or an approach of psychology we call behaviorism. And so it's not just John Watson that we associate with behaviorism, although this is the first time we see this phrase, behaviorism. Classical conditioning is associative learning. Behaviorists emphasize the role of the environment in shaping behavior. So we talked about John Watson and that he used the study of classical conditioning to study human emotion. And we talked about a moment ago how he conducted his famous study on little Albert. And so as a reminder, here we have little Albert who has, he is exposed to a loud noise, and then we have a pairing of the loud noise with a white rat, and then he, when he did this, eventually the white rat causes fear. So he became fearful of the stimulus alone. And we can see here it wasn't just a white rat, it was other things as well that he was conditioned to fear. And so he eventually, he began to generalize his fear. So here we see stimulus generalization. Another approach to learning that falls under behaviorism is operant conditioning. And this was a theory that was proposed by Skinner. So we have some famous theorists here. We have Pavlov, we have Watson, and we have Skinner. So Skinner was different from Pavlov and Watson in that he wasn't focusing on classical conditioning. He focused on the consequences of behavior. So he developed this theory, as I mentioned, called operant conditioning, and it's based on something called the law of effect. And this is a very basic concept that you might not have known that it was called the law of effect, but you already know this, that pleasant consequences lead to a behavior being more likely to happen again. Unpleasant consequences lead to a reduction in the behavior. That's the basic law of effect. So when you show up to work, we get paid, right? So we continue to show up to work. Skinner conducted experiments mainly with rats and pigeons to determine how learning occurs through operant conditioning. And he would have pigeons peck on little discs in this like a chamber, and the pigeons learned that if they would poke on these or peck on these different discs, depending upon what Skinner had identified as the pattern or the way that he wanted them to, that they would get rewarded. And so these pigeons developed real complex responses, knowing that if they were to do this, they would get a reward. So we'll be talking about the different types of responses or the different types of what he called schedules that he used to shape their behavior. But let's start out with some basic terminology. Many of us have heard of the phrase positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. You may have been using those correctly, you may not have. So let's clear those up. When we think of positive in the context of operant conditioning, we need to think of adding something. Positive means adding something, just like addition. So 2 plus 2 is 4. You have a positive sign, you're adding 2, okay? So when we think about positive, we're adding something. It has nothing to do with it being good or bad. In the case of negative, we're taking something away, just like subtraction. 3 minus 2, we're removing 2, equaling 1. We're taking something away. We may be taking something away that's good or bad. It has nothing to do with whether it's good or bad. We just need to think about whether or not something is being removed. Reinforcement is where we see an increase in behavior, and punishment is where we see a decrease in behavior. We'll come back to each of these in a moment so you can understand how we put these together. So here is a Skinner box, and Skinner placed animals inside an operant conditioning chamber, as I mentioned a moment ago, containing a lever in the case of rats, and for pigeons they had they needed to peck. And so in this instance, we see that the rat presses a lever, causing the food to be dispensed as a reward. All right, so let's start with reinforcement. So here we see those two phrases, positive and reinforcement. So if we break these phrases down, this is the most basic, easy one to do. I suppose we have positive, meaning we add something, and reinforcement, we are increasing behavior. So here's the definition. Something is added to increase the likelihood of a behavior. So everyday examples, high grades, paychecks, praise. So let's think about why these are positive reinforcers. If you receive a good grade on a test, you are being positively reinforced so that whatever behavior led to that good grade, you're going to continue. When you get paid, you're being reinforced. Whatever behavior led to that payment, you're going to continue. When you're getting praise, you're being reinforced. You like that. And so you're going to engage in that behavior that led to praise. Here we have a child who's experienced positive reinforcement in the form of a sticker chart. So she's earning a certain number of stickers. Some of you may have had parents who did this with you. If you're parents, you may do this with your kids. And the child is learning that when she does certain things, she gets stickers, and she can trade those in for a trip to the ice cream parlor. In my son's class, they do accelerated reader. They're in 2nd grade, both my sons are. And when they were in 1st grade, they would, after they reached a certain number of points that they earned in what was called accelerated reader, which is a program that you have to read books and then answer comprehension questions about those books. Some of you may know about this. And they had to reach a certain number of points, like a goal. And when they did that, then they got to have a reward, which was a lollipop. And then there was something that they got to do in class that all the kids liked to do, that each kid only got to do when they reached their goal. Now, I thought it was really interesting that my kids were so motivated to get that lollipop because they could get a lollipop at home, not every day, but it wasn't something that was very unusual. But there was something so special for them about that lollipop that they got in their classroom. And I don't think it was just the lollipop as much as it was also about the praise that they got from their teacher, the internal experience of feeling proud. I think it also had to do with what they also got to do, which was like they had this monkey toy that they got to flip across the classroom. And it was something kind of silly, but all the kids loved doing this. And so there were these real powerful reinforcers for the kids. Now, if the reinforcers weren't powerful or meaningful, the kids might not have been as motivated unless there were other sources of motivation outside of that positive reinforcer. Then we have negative reinforcement, and this is where something is removed to increase the likelihood of behavior. So when you get in your car and you have that beeping sound or whatever sound your car makes whenever you don't have your seatbelt on, you then put your seatbelt on to do what? To remove the beeping sound, right? Or when you have a headache and you take Advil or Tylenol, whatever you take, you have learned that that pill is going to remove the headache. It's negatively reinforcing so that the next time you have a headache, you're going to take a pill. Now, some of you might wonder, well, why is that not positive? Because you're adding a pill. Well, the reason it's not is because it's not the act of taking a pill that is enjoyable. It's the removal of the headache that you experience that leads you to continue taking it. Now, I will tell you, there are some instances where just the act itself of taking something can be positively reinforcing. My kids love to take their vitamins, not because they think that they're healthy and so good for them, but they really like them because they like their gummy vitamins, and I think there's sugar on them, which of course is not the best for them. But for them, that is reinforcing. So when they ask for their vitamin and then they get it, the behavior of asking for the vitamin is increased because they got the vitamin, so that next time they say that, they expect they're going to get the vitamin. So asking that is positively reinforced. In the case of removing a headache, it's not the actual swallowing of Advil that's making you want to take it again. It's the removal of the headache. Think about how drug addiction can be, can result from negative reinforcement. And when I say drug, I don't mean just illicit substances, or those that are illegal, even alcohol. Think about someone who uses a substance to remove something, and what they're removing sometimes are uncomfortable feelings. So it might be they're removing anxiety or some other symptoms of a psychological disorder that hasn't been treated. Oftentimes with drug addiction, what is at its root is not the addiction itself, but there is some untreated psychological disorder like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, just to name a few. So that drug that they're taking, whether it be smoking marijuana, drinking alcohol, whatever, or some other substance that they're using, an opiate, that may be negatively reinforcing. It's removing something that they don't like. It can be removing the uncomfortable feelings that they have, and it also can, when it becomes at the point of where it's very addicting, the person is addicted and they develop withdrawal symptoms when they don't have it. It's the removal of those withdrawal symptoms that motivates, that may be part of the reason they're motivated to continue to take that substance. So where you see here that the substance is negatively reinforcing, they're removing the withdrawal symptoms. Okay, so think about your own life where you've been shaped by positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. When you take your test, I'm not likely to ask you to define positive reinforcement or to select the definition, or is the case with negative reinforcement. I'm going to ask you to be able to apply so that you're really showing that deeper learning and understanding. We also have a concept called shaping, and this is a tool that's used in operant conditioning, and this is where instead of rewarding only the target behavior, you reward successive approximations of the target behavior. So think about complex behaviors. Let's start with animals. I can remember not long ago seeing a video of a dog that had learned to ride a bike. Now, I seriously doubt that the dog learned to ride a bike just one day and one day just suddenly got on a bike and knew how to do it. I would imagine that whoever trained the dog had trained the dog using shaping, so that they first broke down the small steps that led to bike riding for that dog. And then what they did then is that they would reinforce each approximation towards the desired behavior. And eventually that animal then can engage in complex behaviors. Adults, this is useful in adults as well. Think about when you're shaping, behaviors in children, more complex behaviors. For a very young child, they may not be great at, making a bed. But when you start to reinforce gradually along the way, so that eventually the child can do, they can pull the sheets up neatly, they can pull the blankets up neatly, they can pull the bedspread up neatly so it looks nice. You've done this probably through a process of shaping. So how does this happen? First, you reinforce any response that resembles the desired behavior. So in the case of the dog, trying to shape them to ride a bike, you're going to start off by reinforcing any response that resembles the desired behavior. So maybe the dog starts putting its paw on the pedal, like it starts just kind of tapping its paw on it. You reinforce that. And you're going to want to come up with a series of steps, by the way, before you start this. You want to come up with steps that gradually approximate the desired behavior, so that, you start with the dog, it's touching the pedal. Then what's the next step that you want the dog to engage in? Maybe it's the dog is climbing onto the bike, okay? And then there's going to be another step and another step. I won't go through every step, but as that dog is engaging in the desired step, you're going to reinforce it. So you start with the basic one. It's touching the paw. It's touching its paw on the pedal, right? And then you reinforce it. Once it's mastered that behavior, you stop reinforcing it. The dog's going to want to be reinforced, so it's going to try some new things. And as soon as it gets to that next step, an approximation of the desired behavior that you've identified, you're going to reinforce it. Then you're going to keep reinforcing it till the dog has mastered it. Once it's mastered it, pull the reinforcement away, and you're going to see novel behaviors emerge. Then once that dog has gone to the next step that's desired, reinforce that, and so forth. So you see that you're gradually rewarding along the way. There are some great videos on YouTube about shaping, and if you have a dog or a cat, it's not just with dogs, it can be with cats or any animal, you can reinforce them through that process of shaping and get them to engage in behaviors you may not have thought they could ever engage in. We also have some other types of reinforcers. We have what are called primary and secondary reinforcers. So remember, rewards to reinforce behavior can come in many different forms. These are just a few that are listed. But there are rewards that are naturally reinforcing, and there are rewards that are reinforcing because they are linked to those that are naturally reinforcing. So primary reinforcers have innate reinforcing qualities. They're naturally reinforcing. We don't need to learn that these are reinforcing. Okay, so we don't need to learn that food is reinforcing. That's natural for us as human beings, where our brains are wired to like sugary foods and to like foods with fat in them. We don't need, and this makes it hard to not eat unhealthy foods sometimes, but those are naturally reinforcing. Secondary reinforcers are those that have been paired with primary reinforcers. So praise, for example, is a secondary reinforcer because it's linked with affection and love, which is a primary reinforcer. Money is reinforcing because it can be used to buy other things that satisfy the basic needs. It's used to buy, for example, food. So we associate money with those things that are naturally reinforcing. Tokens, we could use a token. And so a token is anything that can be used to return or to turn in for a reward. So again, tokens are things that we can turn in for something of value. So really, money is a token in essence. It's something that every society, not every society, but most societies have. I don't say every because we can think of tribal societies and they may use other things that are not a formal a formal monetary system. They may use other things to get what they need. They may trade and barter. But let's think about our own system and that we live in what we could call a token economy. In other words, we can trade in these things that are money that represent something of value, and we can then get something of value with them. We can use token economies outside of our traditional monetary system. So let's say that you have a child who they do certain things every day of the week, and then at the end of the week they can trade those things in for something that they value. My sons really want to get Robux, which is something that you can use to buy, like to get upgrade your character and do things on Roblox, which is for those of you who don't know, which probably many of you do, there are many video games that are online through Roblox. So we kind of came up with an arrangement recently that they have to do certain things each day for a period of so many days, and then they can trade in those points that they get for Robux. So this is a token economy. If you've been to Chuck E. Cheese is a token economy. And it's not the tokens that you're using, which they don't have anymore. Now they have these cards that you put money on to play games. It's the tickets that you get from winning that you trade in for something of value. You're actually engaging in the behaviors that they want. You're spending your money on their games. And then you are able to, if you win, or if you get so many points, you get to have tickets that you can trade in for things that your kid thinks are valuable. And then we have reinforcement schedules. And so if we want to teach a behavior, we want to use positive reinforcement. Going back to that initial question I asked you at the beginning of our review. Reinforcement is the most desired. But there are many ways that you can administer positive reinforcement. We could do it every single time. This is the quickest way to teach a behavior. So every time a dog does something that you want it to, it sits, it shakes your hand with its paw, you reinforce it, you're using continuous reinforcement. And timing is important. You need to pair the treat with the behavior. You want to do so immediately. So with continuous reinforcement of behaviors in adults, if you're wanting to praise someone, you want to recognize them at work, you want to do that ideally immediately afterwards. It's not always what's going to happen, but it is ideal if it can be immediately. It may not be immediately after every desired behavior, but maybe after a collective amount of desired behaviors, like they've finished a big project and so they're reinforced or recognized. So it's important to note, though, that in this instance, that if we're talking about continuous reinforcement, when you remove that reinforcer, then you're going to see that the behavior will likely stop pretty quickly. So in the case of the dog, you keep giving a treat and then you stop, the dog is eventually, is pretty quickly going to pick up that you're not going to be giving the treat and it's not going to engage in that behavior. So what we might do, because we don't always have reinforcers present, is we might use what's called partial reinforcement, or you might also see it called intermittent reinforcement. And this is where the animal or the person doesn't get reinforced every time they display the desired behavior. They're getting reinforced based on a schedule. And so there are different types of reinforcement schedules. We have fixed versus variable and interval versus ratio. So let's first look at this phrase, fixed. This means that it is predictable. And then we have the phrase variable, which it means it changes, it's variable. And then we have interval, which means that the schedule is based on time. And then we have ratio, which means it's based on the number of responses, performance, what the person or animal does. So now we see that there are 4 different types of partial or intermittent schedules of reinforcement. We have fixed interval, fixed ratio, and variable ratio. So a fixed interval schedule is one that is delivered at predictable time intervals. So patients takes the pain relief medication at set times, every however many hours their doctor prescribes. Now we have the patient taking medication and they are experiencing actually negative reinforcement on a fixed interval schedule. It's predictable, but it's based on time. And then we have variable interval. So this is reinforcement is delivered at unpredictable time intervals. So you have Facebook or Instagram or some sort of social media, and you check that social media periodically, and you see that people like your photo or your posting, or they respond to it, and it's not based on any specific schedule. You don't know that every hour someone's going to respond. It's very unpredictable, and it's not based on anything you do. You don't have control over whether other people like your photo or like your comment. So it's a variable interval schedule. So it's interval because it's tied to time. It's not tied to what you do. And it's variable because it's unpredictable. Then we have what's called fixed ratio. And this is where reinforcement is delivered after a predictable number of responses. So we might have a factory worker who's paid every X number of times an item is made. So let's say that for every 3 times a person assembles a calculator, they're going to get X number of dollars. So it's very predictable. And that person knows that they're always going to get reinforced after 3, not after 2, not after 1, but after 3. And then we have variable ratio, and this is where the person is reinforced after an unpredictable number of responses. So if any of you have ever been to a casino, you could think about going to a slot machine. So I remember going to Las Vegas, and we stayed at a hotel that had a casino on the main floor. And I remember seeing people at the slot machines at all hours, and sometimes people would be at the same slot machine for what seemed like hours and hours. So we might leave the hotel and we see someone at a slot machine, and then we return and the same person is at the same slot machine. Well, the reason is likely because of the variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. The person is putting their money into the slot machine, they're pulling the lever, and when they do this, they're anticipating the possibility of a reward. They don't know when they're going to get it. It's very unpredictable. They may think they know. They may have, everyone tries to figure out some sort of method that is helpful in winning money, but I don't know that there is with gambling or with slot machines. Perhaps some of you may know otherwise, but I think that if casinos knew that there was some way, then whoever that person is who's using it might get into some trouble with the casino, but that's a whole other discussion. But we know how addicting gambling is because we keep thinking, if we're pulling that, we put our money in, we pull that lever, we keep thinking to ourselves, maybe it'll be this time. Maybe it'll be this time. So we put money in. Maybe I'm going to get it this time. Oh, no money. Okay, next time. No money. Next time. No money. Next time. Oh, now I got money. And so I get my reward. And so I then feel a compulsion to continue. Maybe I'm going to get it next time. And it might be 8 more times I have to put money in. And then I get rewarded. And then maybe 2. And then I get rewarded. The problem with this schedule for people is that it is very addicting. People don't want to leave that slot machine for fear that the moment they do, someone else is going to put money in and they're going to get reinforced. And this can lead to, this schedule can lead to gambling addiction. And it has an impact on the brain in motivating behavior as people are seeking that feeling of pleasure, that reward that they get, which is a release of dopamine, that reward chemical that they get when they get that reward. So again, interval is based on time, ratio based on what you do, fixed is predictable, variable is not. Think about each of these and how you could relate this to your own experiences, or perhaps just some original examples that you might be able to come up with, and that will help you to think more about this concept of partial reinforcement schedules or scales. You can see here in your textbook, figure 613, we have different schedules of reinforcement, and you can see that these are the different response patterns. So if we look at the one where the cumulative number of responses is highest, that's the variable ratio. So you'll see here the person is getting reinforced, where that line is, that's where the reinforcement is, and their behavior continues. There's not any real drop-off. And it's very unpredictable. You see how you see these lines are there at differing distances from one another because it's unpredictable. And then the purple is the fixed ratio. And here we have a very predictable level of behavior. So we see the behavior increases, it continues, and then the person's reinforced. They might take a little break, a little tiny small space in time where there's a decline. And then we see the behavior is consistent, waiting to the third, for example, in the case of the person getting reinforced for every third thing that they make. They're waiting for that, to complete that third task, get reinforced. We see a little drop off of behavior, maybe a break or something of that nature, but you see it continuing. So you see how this can be very motivating. Here we have a variable interval schedule. And so this is also very motivating. The cumulative number of responses is not as high, but we still see a continued, consistent pattern of responding. And so we here see Facebook, for example. And then we have fixed interval, and we see some dips here where the person is or animal is kind of declining here a little bit, thinking, oh, maybe I'm not going to get that reinforcer. Maybe I'm not going to get it, but I will. I'll be getting it soon. And, it's not as motivating because it's not connected to that person's behavior. They know when it's going to happen, but it's not very connected to their behavior. So we can see a little drop in that here, a little drop in their behavior. So let's now think about the practical application of this. When you think about motivation of behavior, ask yourself, which schedule is the most motivating? Well, clearly it's the variable ratio, right? But in real life, outside of gambling, could we use this? We could probably with, if we're wanting to reinforce behaviors with things like praise or different rewards with adults at work or children in school, or if you're a coach. But let's now imagine a workplace. Could we use a variable ratio schedule for paying someone what they make for a living? Probably not. People need to have predictability in what they're going to get paid. They need to know that there's an expected paycheck. They need to have some knowledge of this. And so for most people, it would be difficult to work under a variable ratio schedule. And so instead, a fixed ratio might be more ideal. And you could think about in sales, how people use this schedule. Managers might use this schedule with employees, and this can be very motivating in getting them to sell things. Or in producing things. So, you go to the mall, and although now with COVID, I haven't been there in a long time, but I know there are kiosks where people sell lots of different products. And I can remember going through the mall, and some people who work at the kiosks will never approach you. They're not very interested in trying to sell their product. Some are relentless, and they do anything and everything they can. And they might be very effective in their strategies. They try to figure out how can they sell more. So ask yourself, which of those two salespeople is being paid based on a fixed ratio schedule? It's likely the one whose pay is tied to performance. The other one is likely being paid on a fixed interval schedule where their pay is disconnected from performance. So they don't have that incentive to sell. So we can see how performance may vary based on pay schedules. This is not to suggest that we should all be paid based on a fixed ratio schedule. You could think about some more complicated issues. Imagine if teachers in high schools were paid on a fixed ratio schedule. For every student who graduated, they got paid. Well, there's an ethical dilemma here, right? They need to get paid, but they may know that some kids may not be ready to graduate. Maybe they didn't pass what they needed to in 12th grade. So there are some important ethical issues that can be tied to this. And here are some socially important behaviors that behavior analysts work on. These include medication compliance, physical therapy compliance, animal behavior in homes and shelters, animal migration and breeding in the natural environment, increasing the effectiveness of staff training, supervision, and employee retention programs, treating fears and phobias, increasing exercise and healthy eating, or living in other public health issues, effective parenting skills, and treating sleep problems, and there are many other applications. In this video, you learned about operant conditioning, including reinforcement, punishment, shaping, primary and secondary reinforcers. You also learned about schedules of reinforcement and their use. And you learned about the application of operant conditioning in real-world settings. In the next video, I'll review Albert Bandura's social learning theory. For more videos like this one, visit the Psychology Lab YouTube channel.